High in the Colorado mountains, where the air cuts sharp and clean, Gideon Thorne stands at the edge of everything he's built and feels absolutely nothing. The richest rancher in 3 counties, owner of more land than most men can ride across, in a day stares out from his mansion's grand windows at an empire that might as well be made of ash. His son's empty bedroom down the hall echoes louder than thunder. His wife's jewelry still sits untouched on her vanity, though she's been gone 2 years now, fled to Boston society where his grief couldn't follow. At 62, Gideon has discovered that wealth can buy everything except the one thing that matters. A reason to wake up tomorrow, so he's running, packing a single bag, abandoning his fortress, and heading down to a forgotten village where nobody knows his name. But what happens when a simple maid sees straight through to his broken soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn leather saddlebag bounced against Gideon's hip as he climbed down from the dusty stagecoach, his boots finding purchase on the wooden planks of Pine Creek's main street. Everything he owned now fit in that single bag, a deliberate choice that felt both liberating and terrifying. Behind him, the coach driver tossed down his traveling case with practiced indifference, already eager to water his horses and move on to the next stop. Pine Creek wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dirt road, with the Sierra Nevada mountains rising like cathedral spires in the distance, the kind of place where time moved at the pace of seasons, rather than stock prices, where a man's worth was measured in calluses rather than cattle, perfect for disappearing. The Mountain View Inn stood at the heart of the settlement, its hand-painted sign creaking gently in the afternoon breeze. 2 stories of honest timber and river stone, with flower boxes beneath each window and a wide porch that invited a man to sit a spell. Nothing like the marble columns and imported crystal of his mansion back in Denver County. This place had been built by hands that knew hard work, not architects who knew wealthy clients. Gideon hefted his bag and pushed through the inn's front door, a brass bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime. The lobby smelled of beeswax and fresh bread, with undertones of pine smoke from the stone fireplace, a far cry from the sterile emptiness of his grand foyer back home. "Well now, don't you look like a man who's traveled some distance?" The voice belonged to a woman in her 50s, round-faced and flour-dusted, wiping her hands on a gingham apron. Her eyes held the kind of warmth that came from decades of welcoming strangers. "I'm Margaret Henderson, but everyone calls me Mrs. H. You'll be wanting a room, I expect." "Yes, ma'am. The name's—" Gideon paused, tasting the lie he'd rehearsed during the long journey. "Gabriel Thornfield. I'm looking for somewhere quiet to stay for a while." "Well, Mr. Thornfield, you've found the right place for quiet. How long?" "Might a while be? Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be longer. I can pay in advance." He reached for his wallet, careful not to reveal the thickness of bills inside. Mrs. Henderson waved away his concern with a practiced gesture. "We'll sort that out later. Right now, you look like you could use some of my beef stew and a good night's rest." She moved behind the registration desk, her movements efficient but unhurried. "Room 7's available. 2nd floor, faces the E. Mountains, nice and peaceful." As she spoke, Gideon became aware of another presence in the lobby. A young woman knelt beside the fireplace, carefully arranging kindling with the patient precision of someone who understood that rushing led to cold nights. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress, while clean and well-mended, spoke of careful economy rather than fashion. She worked with quiet focus, seemingly unaware of the conversation nearby. "That's Elsie," Mrs. Henderson said, following his gaze. "Elsie Marin. Been working here near on 5 years now. Finest girl you'll ever meet. Has a way with fixing things that are broken." The innkeeper's voice carried an affection that spoke of genuine fondness rather than mere employer satisfaction. The young woman, Elsie, glanced up at the mention of her name, and Gideon found himself looking into the clearest grey eyes he'd ever seen. They held him for just a moment, neither welcoming nor wary, simply observing with the quiet intelligence of someone who saw more than most people revealed. Then she returned to her work, building the fire with the same methodical care. "She's got the gift," Mrs. Henderson continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Folks bring her injured birds, lame horses, even ornery old tomcats that won't eat. Somehow she gets them all sorted out, never seen anything like it." Gideon accepted the heavy iron key she offered, its weight solid and reassuring in his palm. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate the welcome. Think nothing of it. Supper's at 6 if you've a mind to join us. Nothing fancy, but it's filling and honest." She paused, studying his face with the shrewd kindness of someone who'd seen many travelers pass through her doors. "You look like a man carrying some heavy baggage, Mr. Thornfield. Pine Creek's a good place for setting down burdens, if you've a mind to." As if summoned by her words, Elsie rose from beside the now crackling fire, dusting off her hands. She moved with the quiet grace of someone comfortable in her own skin, neither hurried nor slow. When she passed Gideon on her way to the kitchen, she offered the briefest of nods, a simple acknowledgement of his presence that somehow felt more genuine than all the elaborate courtesies he'd endured in Denver's social circles. Gideon climbed the narrow stairs to his room, his leather bag growing heavier with each step. Room 7 was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that framed the mountains like a living painting. He set his bag on the bed and walked to that window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel quite so crushing. Elsie Marin had learned long ago that life was a series of small repairs. A torn seam here, a broken wing there, a heart that needed mending most of all. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet competence that came from years of making do with little and finding beauty in the overlooked corners of the world. Her room in the inn's attic was small but her own, furnished with pieces that told stories of careful preservation. The hand-sewn quilt that covered her narrow bed had been her mother's masterwork. Each square a different pattern, each stitch a prayer for warmth in lean times. Rose had been gone 7 years now, claimed by the fever that swept through Pine. Greek the winter, Elsie turned 21, but her presence lingered in every careful stitch of that quilt. The quilt served as more than bedding. It was Elsie's anchor to a heritage of women who had made beauty from scraps, who had found dignity in service, who had loved deeply despite having little to offer beyond their hearts and their willing hands. When the loneliness pressed too close, on winter nights, Elsie would trace the familiar patterns with her fingertips and remember her mother's voice. "We may not have much, sweet girl, but what we have, we tend with love." Dawn came early to the mountains, and Elsie rose with it, as she had every morning for 5 years. Her routine was as comfortable as an old song. Dress quickly in the pre-dawn chill, braid her hair with practiced efficiency, and slip downstairs. To begin the day's work, before Mrs. Henderson's joints reminded the older woman that 63 was no longer young. The kitchen was her domain in these quiet hours. She moved through the familiar tasks with the fluid grace of long practice, stoking the cooking fire, setting water to boil, mixing batter for the day's biscuits. Her hands, calloused from years of honest work, shaped the dough with the same gentle firmness she used when splinting a robin's broken wing or coaxing a frightened colt to accept her touch. The inn's guests often remarked on her way with injured creatures, as if it were some mysterious gift, rather than simple patience combined with genuine care. Just last week, old Tom Bradley had brought her a barn cat that wouldn't heal from a foxbite, infection spreading despite his clumsy attempts at doctoring. Elsie had cleaned the wound with chamomile tea, applied a poultice of comfrey and honey, and spoken to the cat in the low, soothing tones she used with all frightened things. Within days, the cat was purring and pestering Tom for scraps. "It's not magic," she'd told Tom when he marveled at the healing. It's just paying attention to what something needs and having the patience to provide it. The new guest occupied her thoughts as she worked this morning. Gabriel Thornfield, if that was indeed his name, which she doubted, carried himself like a man accustomed to command, yet his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd lost more than he could bear to name. His clothes were well made, but deliberately unremarkable, like a fine horse disguised with mud. Most telling of all were his hands, soft enough to suggest a life removed from manual labor, yet scarred across the knuckles in a way that spoke of harder times, or perhaps harder choices. Elsie had developed a keen eye for reading people during her years at the inn. Travelers revealed themselves in the way they asked for their rooms, how they treated the help, whether they met your eyes when you served their meals. Mr. Thornfield was polite but distant, generous with his coins but careful with his words. A man running from something, though whether it was the law, a woman, or his own conscience remained to be seen. The morning sun was painting the kitchen walls gold when Mrs. Henderson shuffled in, her grey hair escaping its nighttime braid. "Morning, dear heart," the older woman said, accepting the cup of coffee Elsie had ready for her. "How are you finding our mysterious Mr. Thornfield?" "He's hurting," Elsie said simply, not looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "Deep hurt, the kind that doesn't show on the outside." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "I thought as much. Seen that look before. Men who've lost children mostly, or wives who meant more than the world to them." "Should we be concerned?" Elsie asked, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than fear. "I don't think so. There's sadness in him, but no anger, no meanness, just a man who needs some peace and quiet to sort himself out." Mrs. Henderson sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Might do him good to have someone who understands healing nearby. Elsie felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her attention on breakfast preparations. Mrs. Henderson had been making such gentle suggestions for years, as if Elsie's gift with wounded creatures might extend to wounded men. But Elsie had learned to be cautious with her heart. Pine Creek was a small town, and she was a woman alone with no family name or fortune to recommend her. Better to tend her garden, care for her injured animals, and find contentment in useful work than to dream of things beyond her station. Still, as she arranged fresh wildflowers in the small vase that would grace Mr. Thornfield's breakfast table, she found herself wondering what sorrows had driven a man of obvious means to seek refuge in a place like Pine Creek, and whether the same gentle persistence that healed broken wings might someday ease whatever pain had driven him so far from home. The silver pocket watch lay heavy in Gideon's palm as he sat on the edge of his narrow bed, its familiar weight both comfort and torment. His father's watch, handed down through 3 generations of Thorn men, each tick-marking time that could never be reclaimed. The inscription on the back had worn smooth over the decades. "Time is the only true wealth." How wrong his grandfather had been. 3 days had passed since his arrival in Pine Creek, and already the rigid schedule that had governed his life for 43 years was giving way to something more natural. No stock reports to review over breakfast, no meetings with land agents or cattle buyers, no endless stream of decisions that affected hundreds of livelihoods, but somehow left his own feeling hollow. Instead, he woke when the mountain light filtered through his small window, dressed without hurry, and discovered what it meant to have time, but no pressing need to spend it. The inn's daily rhythm was becoming familiar. Mrs. Henderson bustling about with maternal efficiency, guests coming and going with the unhurried pace of people on real vacations rather than business trips, and Elsie moving through it all like a quiet thread that held everything together. She was always working, polishing brass, mending linens, tending the herb garden behind the kitchen, but never seemed hurried or harried. There was a completeness to her that Gideon envied, a sense that she had found her proper place in the world and needed nothing more. He'd taken to sitting on the front porch in the evenings, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, while the sounds of the village settled into peaceful quiet. Pine Creek's citizens were a practical folk. Dr. Samuel Walsh, whose medical practice occupied the front room of his house, and who seemed to know every living soul for 50 miles. Martha and George Clemens, who ran the general store with the kind of honest efficiency that built trust over generations. Young Pastor Timothy, barely 30, but already beloved for his gentle sermons and willingness to split firewood for elderly parishioners. Peaceful here, isn't it? The voice belonged to Doc Walsh, who climbed the inn's front steps with the careful gait of a man whose knees had seen better decades. He settled into the chair beside Gideon with a grateful sigh. Very much so, Gideon agreed, slipping the pocket watch into his vest. I can see why people choose to stay. Most of us didn't choose so much as we just never found a reason to leave. Doc Walsh pulled out a pipe and began the ritual of packing tobacco. Of course, we get visitors like yourself from time to time. City folk looking for something they can't. Quite name. Gideon felt the gentle probing beneath the casual words. In a place like Pine Creek, a stranger was an event worth noting, and he had no doubt that his presence had been thoroughly discussed over coffee and Sunday dinners. Just needed some quiet to think. Best place for it. Mountains have a way of putting things in perspective. The doctor struck a match, and the sweet smoke of good tobacco drifted between them. Elsie mentioned you've been helping with some of the small repairs around the inn. Handy with tools, are you? I know my way around basic carpentry. It was true enough, though Gideon's skills came from necessity rather than trade. A ranch owner learned to fix what broke, whether it was fence posts or hearts, though he'd proven markedly better with the former. Good to hear. We're always in need of willing hands. The church bell's been sticking something fierce, and my arthritis doesn't take kindly to ladder climbing anymore. Before Gideon could respond, Elsie appeared around the corner of the building, carrying a wooden crate that seemed far too heavy for her slender frame. Without thinking, he rose and crossed to her. "Let me take that." She looked up, startled, and for a moment their hands touched as he lifted the crate from her arms. Her fingers were warm despite the evening chill, and calloused in a way that spoke of honest work. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield. Just to the kitchen, if you would." He followed her through the inn's back door, noting how she moved with unconscious grace even when tired. The crate contained jars of preserves and bottles of what looked like homemade remedies, all carefully labeled in a neat feminine hand. "Mrs. Patterson's contribution to the church social next week," Elsie explained, beginning to arrange the items on the kitchen counter. "She's 83 and still insists on doing her own canning. Admirable independence." Gideon found himself reluctant to leave, drawn by the simple pleasure of watching competent hands at work. Doc Walsh mentioned something about a church bell needing repair, among other things. "The parsonage needs a new front step, and the schoolhouse roof has been leaking since the spring rains." She paused in her organizing, studying him with those clear grey eyes. "You needn't feel obligated to help just because you're staying here, Mr. Thornfield. I'm sure you have your own concerns to occupy your time. Actually, I find I have more time than I know what to do with." The admission surprised him with its honesty. It would be good to have useful work for my hands. Something shifted in her expression, a subtle warming that made her seem younger. "Pastor Timothy will be grateful for the help. He's been trying to manage everything himself since Mr. Coleman's back gave out. I'll speak with him tomorrow. He'll be here for breakfast." Early riser, like most of us mountain folk, as Gideon climbed the stairs to his room that night, the pocket watch seemed lighter in his vest pocket. 3 generations of Thorn men had carried it, each building something larger than themselves, each believing that time well spent was time spent in accumulation. But perhaps his grandfather had been half right. Time was wealth, but only when it was spent on things that mattered. And for the first time in years, Gideon was beginning to remember what those things might be. The torn letter arrived on a Tuesday. Morning, delivered by a rider whose horse bore the dust of hard travel and whose urgent manner disrupted the peaceful rhythm of Pine Creek like a stone thrown into still water. Gideon was on the inn's front porch, measuring the loose board that had been bothering Mrs. Henderson, when the messenger approached with the distinctive authority of someone bearing important news, looking for Gabriel Thornfield. The rider called, consulting a piece of paper with official letterhead visible even from a distance. Gideon's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice steady. That would be me. The messenger dismounted and pulled an envelope from his saddlebag, its edges already worn from the journey. From the law offices of Henshaw and Associates in Denver. Said it was urgent. The envelope felt heavier than it should. As Gideon accepted it, the familiar letterhead of his personal attorney visible through the thin paper. He'd left strict instructions with Jonathan Henshaw that he was not to be disturbed unless the ranch was burning or someone was dead. The fact that this letter had found him here, in this forgotten corner of the mountains, meant that neither outcome could be ruled out. "Thank you," he managed, pressing a silver dollar into the rider's palm. Too generous a tip for a simple delivery, but his hands were trembling slightly, and he wanted the man gone before his composure cracked entirely. The messenger tipped his hat and remounted, leaving Gideon alone with the letter and the sudden, crushing weight of the world he'd tried to leave behind. Through the inn's front window, he could see Elsie arranging fresh flowers in the dining room, her movements graceful and unhurried. The sight of her calm industry only made the letter in his hands feel more like a weapon aimed at the fragile. Peace he'd begun to build. He retreated to his room before opening it, closing the door firmly and sitting heavily on the narrow bed. The wax seal broke with a soft crack that seemed to echo in the small space. "Gideon, I've respected your wishes for privacy these past weeks, but circumstances now compel me to reach out. The Blackwood Mining Consortium has made an offer for the ranch, all 50,000 acres, including mineral rights. Their initial proposal is substantial enough to warrant your immediate attention. More pressing, however, is the situation with the mortgage holders on the Crawford property. They're demanding immediate payment of the outstanding balance, and without your signature on the extension documents, foreclosure proceedings will begin within the month. The Crawford family has farmed that land for 3 generations. I understand your need for solitude, but these matters require decisions that only you can make. The ranch operations continue under Henderson's capable management, but your absence is beginning to raise questions among the board members. Please send word of your intentions at your earliest convenience. Your faithful servant, J. Henshaw." The letter trembled in Gideon's hands as the full weight of his responsibilities crashed back over him like a mountain avalanche. 50,000 acres, 300 head of prime cattle, 24 families whose livelihoods depended on wages he provided. And the Crawford farm, good people who'd borrowed against a bad harvest and were now facing ruin because their wealthy neighbor had decided to play at being a common man. He'd thought he could simply walk away, that the machinery of his empire would continue running without him. The arrogance of that assumption now felt crushing. While he'd been learning the simple pleasure of fixing loose boards and sharing quiet conversations, real people were facing real consequences for his absence. Soft knock at his door made him start. "Mr. Thornfield," Elsie's voice concerned but respectful. "The messenger said there might be a reply needed." "No reply," he called back, his voice rougher than intended. "Thank you," but she didn't leave. Instead, her voice came again, gentler. "This time, Mrs. Henderson has fresh coffee brewing if you'd care for some. Sometimes difficult news goes down easier with something warm." The kindness in her offer nearly undid him. Here was genuine concern from someone who knew nothing of his true circumstances, who saw only a fellow human being in distress and offered what comfort she could. How long had it been since anyone had shown him such simple, unselfish care? "I'll be down shortly," he managed. Her footsteps retreated down the hallway, leaving him alone with the letter and the impossible choice it represented. return to Denver and resume the burden of wealth and responsibility that had already cost him everything that mattered, or stay in Pine Creek and watch good people suffer for his selfish need for peace. He folded the letter carefully, his hands steadier now that the initial shock had passed. But as he tucked it into his vest pocket beside his father's watch, he knew that the calm sanctuary he'd found in this mountain village was already slipping away, torn as surely as the edges of the letter that had shattered his borrowed tranquility. The small brown medicine bottle sat on Elsie's windowsill, catching the late afternoon light like amber. She'd spent the morning gathering chamomile and valerian from the meadow above town, herbs that her mother had taught her would quiet a restless mind and ease the kind of sleeplessness that came from carrying too many worries. Mr. Thornfield had been pacing the inn's front porch since dawn, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the tight-shouldered tension of a man wrestling with invisible demons. Elsie had seen that look before, in her father's eyes during the hard winter when the mine closed, and he'd spent long nights staring out the cabin window, calculating debts against dwindling hope. Some burdens were too heavy for one person to carry alone, but pride often made men try anyway, until the weight of their solitary struggle bent them near to breaking. She knocked softly on his door just after sunset, the small bottle warm in her palm. "Mr. Thornfield, I've brought something that might help." The door opened to reveal a man who looked older than he had just yesterday, his face drawn and eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Miss Marin, I appreciate the thought, but it's just herbs," she said gently, offering the bottle. "Chamomile and valerian with a touch of honey. Nothing stronger than what grows in any mountain meadow, but it helps quiet the mind when it won't settle." He accepted the bottle with hands that weren't quite steady, studying the pale liquid within. "How did you know I wasn't sleeping? The floorboards creak when someone paces above the kitchen. Besides, I've seen that look before, like a man, carrying the weight of the world and wondering if his shoulders are strong enough." Something in his expression shifted, a crack in the careful wall he'd built around himself. "Your father? During the mine closure. 18 months without work, watching our savings disappear and winter coming on." She leaned against the doorframe, neither entering his private space nor retreating. He was so determined to solve everything himself that he nearly made himself sick with worry. "Finally, my mother sat him down and told him that sharing a burden doesn't make a man weak, it makes him wise." Gideon turned the bottle in his hands, his thumb tracing the cork stopper. "And if the burden belongs to someone else, if sharing, it might cause more harm than good, then you find a way to help without adding to the weight." Elsie's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd learned hard lessons about responsibility and love. Sometimes the kindest thing is to trust people with the truth, even when it's difficult. He was quiet for so long that she began to think she'd overstepped, offered counsel that wasn't wanted or welcome. But then he looked up, meeting her eyes with an honesty that made her breath catch. What if the truth changes everything? What if it takes away the one good thing you've found in years? The pain in his voice was so raw that Elsie felt her heart constrict in sympathy. Whatever secrets Gabriel Thornfield carried, they were eating him alive with guilt and loneliness. She thought of injured animals who wouldn't let her near until they understood she meant no harm, who needed patience and gentle persistence before they'd accept help. "The truth has a way of coming out eventually," she said softly. "Better to offer it freely than have it discovered by accident. At least then people know you trusted them enough to be honest." He nodded slowly, as if her words had confirmed something he already knew but hadn't wanted to face. "Thank you for the medicine and for the listening ear. Any time you need either one." She turned to go, then paused. "Mr. Thornfield, whatever brought you to Pine Creek, whatever you're running from, sometimes the very thing we're afraid of losing is stronger than we think. Sometimes it can survive the truth." As she walked back to her room, Elsie found herself hoping she was right. Gabriel Thornfield was a good man carrying a heavy burden, and she was beginning to care more than was probably wise about helping him find his way through whatever darkness had driven him to their small mountain village. Behind his closed door, Gideon uncorked the small bottle and breathed in the gentle, earthy scent of the herbs. For the first time since the letter's arrival, he felt a measure of peace settle over his troubled mind. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because for a few precious moments he hadn't faced them alone. The medicine worked better than he'd expected, bringing him the first restful sleep he'd known in days. But more powerful than any herb was the memory of grey eyes filled with compassion, and a voice that offered understanding without demanding explanations in return. The wooden carving tools felt foreign in Gideon's hands at first, their worn handles shaped by decades of use by fingers not his own. Pastor Timothy had offered them almost apologetically when Gideon volunteered to repair the church's damaged altar rail, explaining that his predecessor had been quite the craftsman, but that the tools had sat unused since his passing 3 years prior. "Father McKenna could make wood sing," the young pastor had said, running reverent fingers over a delicate rose carved into the pulpit's edge. Said it was his way of praying with his hands. Now Gideon sat on the church steps in the warm afternoon sun, a piece of pine balanced on his knees as he practiced the basic cuts. The knife moved awkwardly at first, his city-soft hands clumsy with the unfamiliar motions, but gradually muscle memory from his youth began to surface. Summer afternoons spent in his grandfather's workshop, learning to shape wood with patience and respect. "You're holding it too tight." He looked up to find Elsie watching from the church gate, a basket of fresh bread balanced on her hip. The afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and her expression held the gentle patience of someone who understood the learning process. "My grandfather used to tell me the same thing," Gideon admitted, relaxing his grip on the knife. "Said wood had its own nature, and fighting it would only lead to frustration. Wise man." She approached and settled on the step beside him, close, enough that he caught the faint scent of lavender from her soap. "May I?" He handed her the knife and watched as she demonstrated the proper grip, her movements confident and economical. "My father carved," she explained, making a smooth cut that curled away from the blade like a wood-shaving butterfly. "Nothing fancy, but he taught me that every piece of timber has a story hidden inside, waiting for the right hands to reveal it." The tool felt different when she returned it, somehow lighter and more responsive. Under her patient guidance, Gideon found his rhythm, each cut building on the last, until a simple flower began to emerge from the pine. "There," Elsie said softly, approval warm in her voice. "You've found it." The flower wasn't perfect. The petals were uneven and the stem slightly crooked, but it was his, shaped by his own hands and patience. More importantly, the act of creating it had quieted the restless anxiety that had plagued him since the letter's arrival. For these precious hours, there had been only the wood, the blade, and the meditative rhythm of careful work. "Thank you," he said, studying the small carving with genuine pleasure. "I'd forgotten how satisfying this could be." "Useful work has a way of settling the mind," Elsie agreed, rising and brushing wood shavings from her skirt. "My mother always said that keeping your hands busy was the best cure for a troubled heart." As she walked toward the parsonage to deliver her bread, Gideon found himself watching her graceful movements with an awareness that went beyond mere appreciation. There was something deeply appealing about Elsie Maren, not just her gentle beauty, but the quiet strength that made her seem so centered and complete. She moved through the world with a confidence that came from knowing her place in it, from understanding her own worth, regardless of wealth or status. That evening, he continued working by lamplight in his room, the carving growing more detailed with each careful cut. The flower became a rose, its petals layered and complex, its thorny stem a reminder that beauty often came with sharp edges. As he worked, he found himself thinking about roots and growth, about the difference between a life that flourished naturally and one that was forced into unnatural shapes by circumstances and expectations. When he finally set the tools aside, the small wooden rose sat in his palm like a promise. Tomorrow he would return to the church and begin the real work of repairing the altar rail. But tonight, he simply held his creation and marveled at how something so simple could feel like such a profound beginning. The carving tools had given him more than a hobby. They had given him a way to pray with his hands, just as Father McKenna had done, and to discover that even a heart long frozen could still find ways to create something beautiful. The pressed wildflowers filled an entire journal, each bloom carefully mounted between sheets of thin paper with notes written in Elsie's precise hand. Gideon discovered the collection quite by accident when a gust of wind scattered several pages across the inn's back garden, where he'd been replacing loose boards on the chicken coop. "Oh!" Elsie rushed from the kitchen, her hands still flour-dusted from baking, as Gideon carefully gathered the wayward pages. "I'm so sorry. The wind caught them before I could—" "Please, don't apologize." He handed her the rescued sheets, noting the delicate beauty of her botanical work. Each pressed flower was accompanied by detailed observations, blooming dates, locations, weather conditions, and uses both medicinal and practical. "This is remarkable. You've documented the entire valley's flora." A flush colored her cheeks as she clutched the pages against her chest. "It's just a hobby. My mother started it, and well, I couldn't bear to let her work go unfinished. May I?" He gestured toward the journal she still held. After a moment's hesitation, she opened it to a page featuring a cluster of purple lupins. Her mother's handwriting filled the first half of the entry in a flowing script that spoke of formal education, while Elsie's additions below were written in a more practical hand. "Lupines bloom earlier when planted near the south wall of the church. Mrs. Patterson's arthritis improves when she drinks tea made from the leaves, but only the young ones. The older leaves are too bitter." "Your mother was educated," Gideon observed, noting the Latin names written in Rose Marin's careful script. "She was a teacher before she married, from back east originally, Boston, I think, though she never spoke much about her life before Pine Creek." Elsie's voice carried the wistfulness of a daughter who'd always sensed mystery in her mother's past. "She said the flowers were her way of staying connected to learning, even when life took her in different directions." As they walked through the garden together, Elsie pointed out various plants with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a beloved passion. "The comfrey there is excellent for bruises and sprains. I dry it every fall for winter use, and that patch of calendula provides the base for most of my healing salves." Gideon found himself genuinely fascinated, not just by her knowledge but by the gentle confidence with which she shared it. Here was a woman who'd created something of real value, with nothing but curiosity and careful observation, who'd turned a mother's hobby into a practical skill that served her entire community. "The school children love it when I show them the collection," she continued, kneeling to examine a cluster of wild mint. "Little Sarah Henderson, Mrs. H's granddaughter, has started her own flower journal. She brings me specimens every week, so proud of each new discovery." "You'd make an excellent teacher yourself," Gideon said, meaning it completely. Elsie's hands stilled on the mint leaves. "I've thought about it sometimes, but teaching requires formal education, certificates I don't possess. This suits me well enough, sharing what I know in small ways." There was resignation in her voice that struck Gideon as profoundly unfair. Here was a woman with natural teaching gifts and deep knowledge, limited not by ability, but by circumstances, of birth and opportunity. In his world of Denver society, wealthy but empty-headed daughters attended finishing schools, while women like Elsie, who possessed real intelligence and wisdom, remained confined to servant roles. "Knowledge shared is never wasted," he said carefully, "regardless of certificates or formal recognition." That evening, as Gideon worked on his carving by lamplight, He found himself thinking about pressed flowers and hidden talents, about mothers who'd carried mysterious pasts and daughters who'd inherited both their intelligence and their limitations. The wooden rose in his hand seemed inadequate somehow, too simple an offering for someone who created beauty and healing with such quiet mastery. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the most meaningful gifts weren't grand gestures, but small acknowledgements of worth, gentle recognitions that what someone did mattered, that who they were was enough. He set down his carving tools and reached for paper and pen. There were things that could be done quietly, anonymously, to ensure that knowledge and talent weren't wasted for lack of opportunity. Things that a wealthy man could arrange without revealing his identity or disrupting the delicate balance of growing affection. The faded photograph trembled in Gideon's hands as he sat beside Elsie on the inn's back porch, the weight of shared grief making the simple act of speaking feel monumental. The picture showed a boy of perhaps 8 years old, all gap-toothed, grin and wild dark hair, caught in a moment of pure joy as he fed sugar cubes to a patient mare. His name was Benjamin, Gideon said, his voice barely above a whisper. He would have been 15 this autumn. Elsie's hand found his free one, her fingers warm and steady against his trembling palm. She didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes about God's plan or time healing all wounds. She simply sat with him in the growing dusk, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of memory that had been building for weeks. He loved horses more than anything in this world, Gideon continued, emboldened by her silent acceptance. Could gentle the wildest mustang with nothing but patience and sugar cubes. Said they talked to him, though I never quite understood the language. The photograph blurred as tears he'd held back for 2 years finally spilled over. The fever took him in 3 days, and all my money, all my influence, all my desperate bargaining with God, none of it mattered. I couldn't save him. Elsie's thumb traced gentle circles across his knuckles, a touch so soft it might have been imagined but for the comfort it brought. How long ago? 2 years last winter. His mother, Gideon's voice cracked. Claire blamed me. Said if I'd taken him to the specialist in Chicago sooner, if I'd spent less time with the ranch and more time watching for signs of illness. She wasn't wrong. Grief makes us cruel sometimes, Elsie said softly. It needs someone to blame, and the people we love most are closest at hand. She left 3 months after the funeral, took nothing but her jewelry and a single photograph of Benjamin, not the one I kept, but one where he was dressed for church, looking proper and serious. Gideon's laugh held no humor. She chose to remember the boy she thought he should be, not the wild, joyful child he actually was. The silence stretched between them, comfortable despite its weight. Fireflies began their evening dance in the garden, and somewhere in the distance, Mrs. Henderson was humming an old hymn as she finished her kitchen tasks. I failed them both, Gideon whispered. My son and my wife. All that wealth, all that power, and I couldn't protect the things that mattered most. You loved them, Elsie said with quiet conviction. Sometimes that's all we can do, and sometimes even love isn't enough to change what comes, but it's never failure to love someone fully, even when we lose them. She turned the photograph in his hands, studying Benjamin's bright face with the careful attention she gave to all wounded things. He looks like he was happy, like he knew he was cherished. He was. Every day of his short life, he was loved, beyond measure. Then you didn't fail him. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd walked through her own valleys of loss. The love remains, even when the person is gone. It becomes part of who we are, part of how we move through the world. As if summoned by their conversation, a shooting star traced its brief path across the darkening sky. Gideon found himself thinking of Benjamin's delight in such moments, how the boy would have made elaborate wishes and insisted his father do the same. Thank you, he said, carefully tucking the photograph back into his vest pocket, for listening, for understanding. Thank you for trusting me with his memory. Elsie rose gracefully, smoothing her skirts. "He was beautiful, your Benjamin. I can see his father's eyes in his face." Long after she'd gone inside, Gideon remained on the porch, feeling lighter despite the tears that still tracked down his cheeks. For the first time since Benjamin's death, sharing his son's memory had brought comfort instead of agony, connection instead of isolation. Perhaps grief shared truly was grief halved, and love spoken aloud was somehow doubled. The iron horseshoe caught the morning light as Gideon hefted it above the inn's front door, its weight solid and familiar in his hands. Pastor Timothy held the ladder steady below, while Doc Walsh called out suggestions from his position on the porch steps, his arthritic hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "A bit higher on the left," the doctor advised, squinting up at Gideon's handiwork. "There, that's got the balance right. Old Seamus always said a horseshoe hung crooked brings crooked luck." "And who was old Seamus?" Gideon asked, adjusting the iron piece with the careful precision he'd learned from 20 years of ranch work. The familiar weight of the hammer felt good in his grip, and the simple task of hanging the shoe properly was oddly satisfying. "Village blacksmith for nigh on 40 years, Pastor Timothy replied, steadying the ladder as Gideon drove the final nail home. "Passed on last winter, but his wisdom lives on in everything he taught us about iron and fire." Mrs. Henderson emerged from the inn just as Gideon descended the ladder, her face brightening at the sight of the horseshoe mounted securely above her entrance. "Oh, that's perfect! Seamus always said the inn needed proper protection, and I've been meaning to hang that shoe since spring." "Where did you come by your knowledge of metalwork, Mr. Thornfield?" Doc Walsh inquired, his physician's eye noting the professional competence with which Gideon had handled the tools. "You've got the hands of a man who's done his share of honest labor." Gideon felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with questions about his past, but found the deflection came easier now. "Learned young that a man who can't fix what breaks around him is dependent on others for his comfort. My grandfather believed in practical education." It wasn't entirely a lie. Old Isaiah Thorne had indeed insisted that every man in the family understand the fundamentals of ranch work, from shoeing horses to mending fence. "A Thorne who can't work with his hands," the patriarch had often declared, "is no Thorne at all." Of course, grandfather had never intended for his heir to actually perform such labor. That was what hired men were for. But the skills had proven more valuable than status in the quiet peace of Pine Creek. Elsie appeared around the corner of the building, leading a limping bay gelding with the patient care she showed all injured creatures. The horse favored his left front hoof, and even from a distance, Gideon could see the telltale signs of a thrown shoe and possible stone bruise. "What's the matter with old Chester?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her maternal concern extending to every creature on her property. "Threw his shoe sometime during the night," Elsie replied, running gentle hands along the horse's neck. "There's no swelling, but he's tender on that hoof. I've cleaned it and checked for stones, but he needs proper shoeing. Murphy's the nearest farrier, but he's gone to Denver for his daughter's wedding," Doc Walsh observed. "Won't be back for a week at least." Gideon found himself stepping forward before conscious thought caught up with intention. "I could take... Oh, look, I'm no professional, but I've shod my share of horses over the years." The surprise on their faces was quickly replaced by relief, and Gideon realized he'd just revealed another skill that didn't quite fit with his carefully constructed identity as a drifting gentleman. But the need in Elsie's eyes as she looked at the suffering animal overrode his caution about maintaining his facade. "You do that?" she asked, hope warming her voice. "Of course. Chester's been good to me on our morning rides. Least I can do is return the favor." As he knelt beside the patient gelding, feeling for heat and swelling in the affected hoof, Gideon was aware of Elsie, watching his every movement with growing curiosity. His hands moved with the automatic competence of long experience, checking for abscess, examining the sole for embedded stones, assessing the angle needed for a proper shoe. "You handle him like you've been around horses all your life," she observed quietly. Haven't met a horse yet that couldn't be reasoned with. Given. Patience and respect, Gideon replied, already planning the work ahead. The embroidered handkerchief was a work of art in miniature, its corners decorated with delicate wildflowers that seemed to dance across the fine linen in threads of blue and gold. Elsie had worked on it during the quiet evening hours, her needle moving with the same patient precision she brought to all her healing work. Each tiny stitch an expression of growing affection she couldn't quite voice aloud. She presented it to Gideon after breakfast on a morning when autumn's first touch painted the mountain peaks with gold. Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and nervousness that made her seem younger than her 28 years. "It's nothing. Grand," she said, pressing the handkerchief into his hands with the hurried manner of someone afraid that hesitation might lead to retreat. "Just something useful that might remind you of Pine Creek when you—" She faltered, unable to finish the sentence that acknowledged what they both knew, that he would eventually leave this place that had become a sanctuary for them both. Gideon unfolded the handkerchief with reverent care, studying the intricate needlework that had transformed simple cloth into something beautiful. The wildflowers were perfect replicas of those in her botanical collection, lupines and paintbrush, columbines and mountain laurel, each rendered with such attention to detail that he could almost smell their summer sweetness. "Elsie," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't hide, "this is extraordinary. I've never received a gift made with such—" He searched for words adequate to the feeling swelling in his chest. "Such love." The word hung between them, like a confession neither had meant to make, and for a moment the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elsie's grey eyes widened, and Gideon realized with crystalline clarity that what had begun as gratitude and grown into affection had transformed into something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. "I wanted you to have something beautiful," she whispered. "Something that would last." The handkerchief trembled in his hands as the full weight of her gift settled over him. Here was a woman who had so little that every thread represented a careful choice, every hour of work, a sacrifice of time she could have spent on practical pursuits. Yet she had created this beautiful thing for him, had poured her heart into every careful stitch, knowing that he would leave and take her gift, and perhaps her heart, with him. "I don't deserve this," he said, the words torn from some deep place where his guilt and self-recrimination lived. "I don't deserve your kindness, your—" "Stop!" Her voice carried a firmness he'd never heard before, and when he looked up, her eyes blazed with quiet fire. "Don't you dare diminish what I've freely given. I know my own mind, Gabriel Thornfield, and I know my own heart. You've brought more joy to this place, to my life, than you seem to understand." The use of his false name was like a physical blow, reminding him of the deception that lay at the foundation of everything beautiful that had grown between them. How could he accept her gift, her growing love, when it was built on lies, when the man she thought she cared for was as much a fiction as the name he'd given her? "What if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about someone was wrong?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if the person you cared for had deceived you from the very beginning?" Elsie considered this with the same thoughtful attention she gave to all serious questions, her fingers absently smoothing her apron as she thought. "I suppose it would depend on the nature of the deception," she said finally, "and the reason behind it. A lie told to spare feelings is different from one told to gain advantage. A false name chosen for privacy isn't the same as one used for fraud." She stepped closer, her hand rising to touch his cheek with a gentleness that nearly undid him completely. "I see your heart, whatever name you call yourself. I see your kindness, your pain, your struggle to become better than you were. Those things can't be counterfeited, no matter what secrets you might carry." That night, Gideon sat by his window with the handkerchief spread across his palm, tracing the embroidered flowers with trembling fingers, and wondering how love could feel simultaneously like salvation and damnation. The land deed document lay, spread across Gideon's small table like an accusation, its official seals and legal language stark against the room's humble furnishings. He'd retrieved it from his saddlebag that morning with hands that shook despite his best efforts at composure, knowing that the time for careful deception was drawing to a close like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. The knock at his doctor came just as he finished reading the final paragraph for the third time, his attorney's urgent postscript burning in his memory. The Blackwood Consortium has increased their offer. They now propose to purchase not only your ranch, but the entire Pine Creek Valley. Their representatives are already en route to survey the area. Time is of the essence. Mr. Thornfield? Elsie's voice carried a note of concern that made his stomach clench with fresh guilt. There's a gentleman downstairs asking for you. Says he's come from Denver on business. Gideon's blood turned to ice water. He folded the deed with deliberate care, his mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had Henshaw grown impatient and sent someone to find him? Had word of his presence here somehow reached the wrong ears? Or worse, had the Blackwood Consortium's advanced scouts already arrived to begin their predatory assessment of everything he'd come to love about this place? Did he give his name? Gideon asked, fighting to keep his voice steady as he tucked the document inside. His vest, Mr. Harrison, he said, mentioned something about urgent matters requiring your immediate attention. There was a pause, then Elsie's voice came again, softer now and tinged with worry. Gabriel, you've gone very pale. Should I tell him you're not available? The kindness in her offer, her instinctive desire to protect him from whatever had brought fear to his eyes, nearly broke his resolve entirely. Here was a woman who would stand between him and trouble without knowing its nature, who trusted him enough to offer shelter despite the growing questions about his identity. No, he said, straightening his shoulders with the automatic bearing of a man accustomed to facing difficult situations. I'll be down directly. The man waiting in the inn's lobby was everything Gideon had expected. Expensive suit, calculating eyes, and the predatory stillness of someone comfortable wielding other people's money as a weapon. James Harrison represented the Blackwood Consortium, with the same ruthless efficiency that had made them the most feared mining operation in 3 states. Mr. Thorne, Harrison said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that Mrs. Henderson and Elsie, both bustling about their morning tasks, couldn't fail to hear the name. I've been looking forward to this conversation. The simple use of his real name hit the quiet lobby like a thunderclap. Gideon felt rather than saw Elsie's sudden stillness behind the registration desk, heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Henderson as she paused in her dusting of the mantelpiece. In 2 words, Harrison had shattered the careful fiction that had allowed Gideon to find peace in this mountain sanctuary. Perhaps we could speak privately, Gideon suggested, his voice steady despite the chaos roiling in his chest. Oh, I think this concerns the entire community, Harrison replied, with the smooth malice of a man who enjoyed destroying things. After all, we're here to discuss the future of Pine Creek Valley. Your valley, as it happens. That's impossible, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice small with confusion. Mr. Thornfield is just a guest here. He doesn't own what exactly? Harrison's smile was sharp as winter wind. The largest ranch in Colorado, the mineral rights to half the Sierra Nevada range. Or perhaps you're referring to his controlling interest in the railroad spur that determines whether places like Pine Creek live or die. The silence that followed was deafening. Gideon could feel Elsie's eyes on him like a physical weight, could sense the precise moment when her world shifted to accommodate this new and terrible knowledge. The man she'd grown to care for, the gentle soul she'd offered healing and love, was Gideon Thorne, the cattle baron whose wealth and influence made him one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Hello, Elsie," he said quietly, finally meeting her stricken gaze. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way. The wedding ring lay cold against Gideon's palm, its gold surface worn smooth by years of wear and the restless turning it had endured during sleepless nights after Claire's departure. He'd carried it in his vest pocket since arriving in Pine Creek, unable to wear it, but equally unable to abandon it completely, a circular reminder of vows broken by grief and promises that death had rendered impossible to keep. Now sitting, alone in his room while the inn buzzed with whispered conversations about his revealed identity, he held the ring up to the lamplight and saw his failures reflected in its polished surface. Below, he could hear Harrison's voice pontificating about progress and prosperity, painting pictures of the modern mining operation that would transform Pine Creek from a sleepy mountain village into an industrial center. The consortium's plans are quite generous, Harrison was saying, his words carrying clearly through the thin floors. Full market value for all properties, plus relocation assistance for any families who prefer to start fresh elsewhere. Really, it's an opportunity for everyone to improve their circumstances. What Harrison didn't mention, what his smooth sales pitch carefully omitted, was the reality of what mining operation meant. Gideon had seen Blackwood's other projects, entire mountainsides stripped bare, streams poisoned with runoff, communities scattered like leaves before a windstorm. Within 5 years, nothing would remain of Pine Creek's gentle beauty except scars in the earth and toxic pools where clear streams once ran. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Thorne," Elsie's voice, carefully formal now, stripped of the warmth that had grown between them over these precious weeks. "May I have a word?" She entered when he called permission, but stopped just inside the door, as if approaching closer might contaminate her with his deception. Her face was pale, but composed, her hands clasped before her with the rigid control of someone holding herself together through sheer will. "Is it true," she asked without preamble, "what that man says about your ownership of the valley?" "Yes." The simple admission felt like swallowing ground glass. "I own the land rights to most of the valley, including the mineral claims that Blackwood wants to exploit. And the railroad interests. Those too." Gideon set the wedding ring on his table, its soft click unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "My family has been building wealth and influence in this territory for 3 generations. I am, as Mr. Harrison so eloquently put it, one of the most powerful men in Colorado." Elsie absorbed this information with the same careful attention. She gave to examining wounded animals, looking for the extent of injury beneath surface symptoms. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was a coward." The honesty came easier now that there was nothing left to lose. "Because for the first time in years, someone looked at me and saw a man worth caring about, rather than a fortune worth pursuing. Because I was selfish enough to want that feeling to last a little longer. And your wife, your son?" Gideon's hand moved instinctively toward the ring, then stopped. "Both real. Benjamin died of scarlet fever 2 years ago. Claire, my wife, couldn't bear the sight of me afterward. She blamed me for not saving him, and she wasn't wrong. All my wealth, all my connections, and I couldn't protect the one thing that mattered most." Understanding flickered in Elsie's eyes, the healer in her recognizing the familiar shape of a guilt wound that had never properly closed. "So you came here to hide?" "I came here to disappear," he corrected. "I was ready to sell everything, give up completely. Pine Creek was supposed to be a place to say goodbye to the world, but it became something else. It became the first place I'd felt truly alive since Benjamin died." He met her gaze directly, needing her to see the truth. "Beneath his earlier deceptions, it became the place where I fell in love with a woman who saw past wealth and title to whatever decent man might still exist underneath." Elsie's composure cracked just slightly, a flicker of pain crossing her features before she regained control. "That woman was in love with Gabriel Thornfield, a simple man seeking peace in a mountain village. She doesn't know Gideon Thorne at all." The banker's telegram arrived at sunset, its yellow paper crackling like autumn leaves, as Gideon read the urgent message that shattered his last hope of keeping his two worlds separate. The words blurred together in the lamplight. Crawford Farm. Foreclosure imminent. Board demanding your return. Stock prices falling on rumors of your disappearance. Immediate response required. Henshaw. 23 families depended on wages from his ranch operations. The Crawford Farm. 3 generations of honest farmers facing ruin because their wealthy neighbor had decided to play at being a common man while his responsibilities crumbled. Good people who would lose everything because Gideon Thorne had been too selfish to face his duties and too cowardly to properly delegate his authority before running away. He sat heavily on his narrow bed, the telegram still clutched in his trembling hands, and felt the full weight of his position crushing down like an avalanche. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would allow him to keep both his sanctuary and his conscience. The boy who'd learned wood carving and found peace in simple labor would have to die so that the cattle baron could return to save the lives he'd endangered through his absence. A commotion in the street below drew him to his window. Harrison stood in front of the general store, surrounded by half the village population, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air as he painted glowing pictures of the prosperity that Blackwood's mining operation would bring to Pine Creek. Modern machinery, gentlemen. Railroad connections direct to Denver and beyond, steady wages for every able-bodied man, and housing that meets the standards of civilization rather than frontier privation. Harrison gestured expansively at the modest buildings around him. Your children will thank you for embracing progress rather than clinging to sentiment. George Clemens, whose general store had served the community for 30 years, stepped forward with the quiet dignity that marked all his interactions. And what of the families who've built their lives here? The farms, the inn, the church where our grandparents are buried. Relocations are part of every great enterprise, Harrison replied smoothly. Blackwood Industries provides generous compensation packages. Most families find they can purchase far superior properties in established towns with the proceeds from their sales here. What about the land itself? Doc Walsh asked, his physician's training making him think beyond immediate human concerns. The streams, the wildlife, the forests? Harrison's smile grew cooler. Dr. Walsh, isn't it? Progress requires sacrifice. The mineral wealth beneath this valley can power the growth of the entire territory. Surely, a man of science understands that resources left undeveloped serve no useful purpose. From his window, Gideon could see Elsie standing at the edge of the crowd, her face pale in the gathering dusk. She held her mother's botanical journal pressed against her chest like a shield, and he knew she was thinking of the pressed wildflowers, the careful notes about healing properties, the generations of knowledge that would be lost when the mining. Machines stripped away every living thing in their path. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the inn's front door, her usually cheerful face etched with worry. And what of Mr. Thorne's opinion in all this? Surely the landowner has some say in whether his property is sold. Harrison's laugh was as sharp as winter wind. I'm afraid Mr. Thorne's current situation somewhat complicates his decision-making capacity. However, Blackwood Industries is prepared to make him an offer that any rational businessman would find irresistible. The threat was clear enough. Gideon's prolonged absence, his apparent breakdown, the whispered rumors about his mental state following his son's death. All of it could be used to question his competence, to force a sale through legal maneuvering if he proved unwilling to negotiate. The telegram crackled again in his hands as he crushed it into a tight ball. There was no escape, no magical solution that would allow him to remain Gabriel Thornfield. While Gideon Thorne's empire demanded its master's return, the choice was brutal in its simplicity: save Pine Creek and lose Elsie, or protect his growing love and watch everything he'd come to cherish be destroyed by his own cowardice. Below in the street, the crowd was dispersing, neighbors heading home to contemplate an uncertain future, while Harrison returned to his room with the satisfied air of a man who'd planted the right seeds of doubt and fear. The birth certificate was yellowed with age, its edges soft from years of careful handling, and the name written in faded ink made Elsie's world tilt on its axis. Elizabeth Rose Blackwood, born October 15th, 1847, Boston, Massachusetts. Father, Edmund Blackwood. Mother, Catherine Fitzgerald Blackwood. She found it tucked between the pages of her mother's botanical journal, wrapped in a letter she'd never seen before, as she prepared to pack away Rose Marin's belongings before the mining consortium could destroy everything she'd ever called home. The letter was addressed to "My dearest daughter" in her mother's careful script, and dated just 3 days before the fever claimed her. "My precious Elsie, if you are reading this, then the secrets I carried have finally grown too heavy for silence. I pray you will forgive an old woman's cowardice in waiting so long to share the truth of who you truly are. Your father was Edmund Blackwood, heir to one of Boston's greatest fortunes, and my employer when I worked as a governess for his young cousins. We fell in love despite the impossible gulf between our stations, and for one brief, shining year, I believed that love might conquer all social barriers. But when his family discovered our attachment and my condition, they moved swiftly to protect their precious reputation. Edmund was given a choice: marry the senator's daughter they had selected for him, or be disowned completely. It was offered a substantial sum to disappear quietly and never speak his name again. We were both young and frightened, and the pressure from his family was overwhelming. In the end, we chose the path that seemed to offer you the best chance at a respectable life, even if it meant separating us forever. I took their money and fled west, reinventing myself as Rose Marin, a widow seeking a fresh start. Your father never knew where we went, and I pray he found some measure of happiness in the life his family chose for him. But you, my darling girl, carry his blood as surely as you carry mine. You are not just the daughter of a village maid. You are a Blackwood, with all the strength and intelligence that name represents. I kept your birth certificate as proof, though I never intended you to need it. The botanical work I began was more than hobby. It was preparation. Education, even informal education, can never be taken from you. Knowledge is the one inheritance that no lawyer can steal, no society matron can diminish. If circumstances ever require you to claim your heritage, know that you have every legal right to do so. But more importantly, know that whatever name you bear, whatever station life has given you, you are worthy of love and respect and all the beautiful things this world has to offer. Your devoted mother, Rose. Elsie's hands shook as she read the letter. A second time, then a third, each word reshaping everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. The implications crashed over her like successive waves. She was the illegitimate daughter of Edmund Blackwood, which made James Harrison, who had spoken so casually of the family business, her cousin. The Blackwood consortium wasn't just threatening her home. It was being directed by her own blood relatives, people who had no idea she existed. She thought of Harrison's smooth confidence, his casual dismissal of the village's worth, and felt a cold fury building in her chest. Did he know? Had the family maintained records of Edmund's youthful indiscretion? Or was it simply cruel irony that brought a Blackwood to destroy the life that another Blackwood's daughter had built from nothing? The birth certificate felt both weightless and impossibly heavy in her hands. According to the law, she had a legitimate claim to the Blackwood name and fortune. Edmund had never married. She'd heard Harrison mention his uncle's bachelor status during his presentations to the villagers. That made her theoretically his only direct heir. But claiming such inheritance would require proving her identity, acknowledging a connection to the very family that now threatened everything she loved. It would mean stepping into a world of wealth and power that felt as foreign as the moon, abandoning the simple life she'd built through honest work and gentle healing. The thought of trading her herb garden for Boston drawing rooms, her botanical journal for social obligations, filled her with something approaching panic. A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Elsie," Mrs. Henderson's voice, worried and motherly. "Dear, you've been up there for hours. Harrison's gone back to his hotel, and we need to talk about what happens next." "Coming," Elsie called, hastily folding the letter and certificate back into the botanical journal. But as she rose to join the worried conference downstairs, her mind was already racing with possibilities that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The inn's common room felt smaller, with the weight of crisis pressing down on its familiar walls. Doc Walsh sat with his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, while Pastor Timothy paced before the fireplace with the restless energy of a man seeking divine guidance. Mrs. Henderson settled into her favorite chair with the careful movements of someone trying to project calm while her world crumbled. "The legal situation is clear enough," Doc Walsh was saying as Elsie entered. "Thorne owns the land rights, and if he chooses to sell to Blackwood, there's nothing we can do to stop him." "But surely he wouldn't," Mrs. Henderson protested. "Not after living here, seeing what this place means to people. He's not the same man who arrived 6 weeks ago, isn't he?" Pastor Timothy's voice carried the gentle sadness of someone who'd counseled many souls through difficult truths. "We thought we knew Gabriel Thornfield, but Gideon Thorne is a stranger to us. His responsibilities extend far beyond Pine Creek. He has employees, obligations, a whole empire that depends on his decisions." Elsie took her usual seat by the window, the journal clutched in her lap like a secret weapon she wasn't yet ready to deploy. "Has anyone spoken with him since Harrison left?" "He locked himself in his room hours ago," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Won't answer when I knock, won't come down for supper. That man is wrestling with demons, and I'm not sure which side is winning." "Perhaps we should give him space to make his decision," Doc Walsh suggested. "Pressuring him now might only push him toward the choice we least want him to make." "And if he chooses to sell?" Pastor Timothy asked. "If he decides that his other responsibilities outweigh his feelings for this place?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They all knew the answer, even if none wanted to speak it aloud. Blackwood's machines would arrive within months, and Pine Creek would become another scar on the mountainside, another community sacrificed to the endless hunger for mineral wealth. "There might be another option," Elsie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. All three turned to look at her with expressions of desperate hope, as if her calm certainty might somehow provide the miracle they needed. What if the Blackwood Consortium didn't have the legal authority to purchase the land? What if someone with a stronger claim objected to the sale? Doc Walsh frowned, his lawyer's training from his youth surfacing despite decades of medical practice. "What kind of stronger claim? Thorne's ownership is clear and uncontested." Elsie opened the botanical journal and withdrew the birth certificate, its aged paper rustling like autumn leaves, the kind that comes from being Edmund Blackwood's daughter and legal heir. The silence that followed was so complete that Elsie could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Mrs. Henderson's face went white as fresh snow, while Doc Walsh stared at the certificate as if it might bite him. Pastor Timothy sat down heavily, his pastoral composure cracking under the weight of this revelation. "Sweet, merciful heaven," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Rose never said, she never even hinted she was protecting me," Elsie replied, smoothing the worn paper with trembling fingers. "Protecting us both from a truth that could have destroyed the life we'd built here." Doc Walsh leaned forward, his medical precision extending to legal documents. "If this is genuine, and it appears to be, then you have a legitimate claim to the Blackwood family interests. Edmund never married, never had other children. Harrison mentioned his uncle's bachelor status several times, called him a stubborn old man who refused all attempts at matchmaking. Then legally you're his heir," Pastor Timothy said slowly, wonder creeping into his voice. You could contest any sale, demand a voice in family business decisions. I could do more than that, Elsie said, feeling strength flow through her as the full scope of possibility became clear. I could stop them entirely. The legal contract spread across Doc Walsh's kitchen table looked innocent enough. 20 pages of dense text and official seals that would either save Pine Creek or destroy the last vestiges of the life Elsie had known. The morning sun streamed through lace curtains, illuminating the document that James Harrison had drawn up with ruthless efficiency, a binding agreement that would transfer Gideon's land rights to the Blackwood Consortium within 48 hours. The language is ironclad, Doc Walsh said, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the terms one final time. Once Thorne signs this, there's no legal recourse for the community. Blackwood gains complete control over mineral and development rights for the entire valley. Elsie stood beside him, her mother's birth certificate and letter arranged on the table like battle plans. She'd spent the sleepless night wrestling with the implications of her newfound heritage, weighing the cost of claiming a birthright she'd never wanted against the destruction of everything she held dear. And if I present myself as Edmund Blackwood's heir, she asked, though she already knew the answer from their earlier discussions, then you have legal standing to contest any sale of family assets, Pastor Timothy replied from his position by the window. As Edmund's only child, you inherit not just his personal wealth, but his controlling interest in the consortium itself. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The village maid who made healing salves and pressed wildflowers would become one of the most powerful women in the Colorado Territory, if she was willing to step into a world that had rejected her mother, and might well reject her too. Mrs. Henderson bustled in with a fresh pot of coffee, her movements betraying the nervous energy that had kept her pacing since dawn. "Any word from upstairs?" she asked, though they all knew Gideon hadn't emerged from his room since Harrison's ultimatum the previous evening. "Still locked away," Doc Walsh replied. "Can't say I blame him. The choice he's facing would break a lesser man." Through the kitchen window, they could see Harrison's buggy parked before the inn, its driver waiting with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to wealthy men's schedules. The consortium representative had arrived at first light, dressed for business and carrying additional documents that would expedite the land transfer once Gideon capitulated to the inevitable. "He's a good man caught in an impossible situation," Pastor Timothy observed, his pastoral wisdom cutting to the heart of the matter. "Save his business obligations and watch Pine Creek be destroyed, or protect our home and let innocent families suffer for his absence." Elsie traced the edge of her birth certificate with one finger, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. What if there was a third option? What if he didn't have to choose between his responsibilities and this place? "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson asked, settling into her chair with the careful attention of someone who sensed momentous words approaching. "Gideon owns the land, but he doesn't own the mineral rights exclusively. If I claim my inheritance, I become his partner in any decisions about development. I could refuse to allow the mining operation, regardless of what financial pressure he faces." Doc Walsh nodded slowly, his legal mind working through the implications. "That's true, but it would require you to reveal yourself to Harrison and the consortium. Once they know who you are, your quiet life here ends forever." "It's already ended," Elsie said with a calm certainty that surprised even her. "The moment Harrison spoke Gideon's real name, everything we thought we knew about our lives here became fiction. The question now is what kind of truth we build from the ruins." A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. Gideon had finally emerged from the inn, dressed in his traveling clothes and carrying his worn leather saddlebag. His face held the grim resolution of a man who'd wrestled with his conscience through the long night and emerged bloodied but decided. Harrison approached him with the predatory confidence of someone who smelled victory, the contract prominently displayed in his manicured hands. "Mr. Thorne, I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer. The consortium is prepared to transfer funds immediately upon execution of these documents. The simple gold ring caught the afternoon sunlight as Gideon slipped it onto Elsie's finger, its modest beauty a deliberate choice that spoke of love chosen freely rather than alliances built on convenience. 6 months had passed since the confrontation. In the church, 6 months of legal battles won, community projects flourishing, and 2 hearts learning to trust again after years of careful protection. With this ring, Pastor Timothy intoned, his young voice carrying the weight of ancient promises, I thee wed, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer. He paused, smiling at the gentle laughter from the assembled congregation. Though I suspect you've both already tested those particular boundaries. The wedding was everything a Pine Creek celebration should be. Simple, heartfelt, and centered on community, rather than spectacle. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with the feast, using receipts from Elsie's botanical journal to create dishes that honored both tradition and innovation. Doc Walsh had composed a speech about healing that brought tears to more than a few weathered faces. The church overflowed with neighbors who'd become family, friends who'd stood by them through the storms of revelation and change. Elsie's dress was her mother's, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, but left unchanged in its essential grace. Ivory silk with pearl buttons and lace that spoke of dreams carried carefully across years and miles. She wore wildflowers in her hair instead of expensive jewels, their simple beauty more precious than any tiara could have been. Gideon had chosen to dress as Gabriel Thornfield might have, a good suit but not ostentatious, clothing that spoke of prosperity earned rather than inherited. The man who stood beside Elsie was neither the broken cattle baron who'd fled to the mountains, nor the fictional drifter seeking peace, but something new, a person who'd learned to balance responsibility with joy, duty with love. You may kiss. Your bride, Pastor Timothy announced, and when Gideon's lips met Elsie's, the congregation erupted in cheers that echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. The Crawford farm had been saved, its mortgage restructured through a quiet partnership between Thorn Enterprises and the newly established Blackwood Foundation. 23 ranch families continued to draw wages from operations now managed by a board that included worker representatives alongside traditional shareholders. The legal challenges from Blackwood Industries had crumbled as quickly as Harrison's bluster once Elsie's inheritance claim was properly documented. Most importantly, Pine Creek itself had flourished. The community center bore a plaque honoring Rosemarin's contributions to local botanical knowledge. A small school employed 2 teachers, one of whom was Elsie herself, her natural gifts finally given proper scope. The inn expanded to accommodate visitors drawn by the area's reputation for healing and natural beauty rather than mining wealth. As the celebration wound down and neighbors began their journeys home, Gideon and Elsie stood together in the garden behind the inn, watching the sun set behind peaks that would forever remain untouched by industrial machinery. Any regrets? Gideon asked, his arm encircling his wife's waist as naturally as breathing. Only that it took us so long to find each other, Elsie replied, leaning into his warmth. And that Benjamin couldn't be here to see his father find happiness again. Gideon's throat tightened with emotion that was sweet rather than bitter. I think he knows, he said softly. I think he'd approve of our choices. Above them, the team. First stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, Mrs. Henderson was humming an old hymn as she cleaned the wedding dishes, the same tune she'd hummed on the night Gideon first arrived in Pine Creek, lost and seeking. Sanctuary he'd never thought to find.